The world sees a woman with a quiet smile, a gentle voice, a patience that seems bottomless. They think I bend because I don't break in front of them. They are wrong. I bend so I can coil. I was 8 when my mother, Elena, remarried, and we moved into Gerald's basement in a building where the walls sweated and the cockroaches owned the dark. The apartment complex squatted on the edge of the city, a gray concrete box where hope went to mildew. Our unit was half underground, with one small window near the ceiling that looked out onto a parking lot. I used to stand on a milk crate to watch people's feet walk past. Shoes, ankles, the occasional stray cat. That was my view of the world for 6 years. I learned to sleep with my fists closed. Gerald's eyes followed me everywhere, slick and slow, and I learned to make myself small, invisible, a piece of furniture he might overlook. He never touched me at first. That was the insidious part. He just watched. He watched me eat, watched me do my homework at the kitchen table, watched me walk to the bathroom. His gaze was a physical weight, like a hand pressing down on the back of my neck. I told my mother once, when I was 11, and she looked at me with an expression I would later understand as pure, distilled cowardice. "He's just looking," she said. "Don't make trouble. We have nowhere else to go." By 15, I had stopped telling her anything. By 15, I had started sleeping with a piece of scrap metal under my mattress, a strip of iron I'd found behind the dumpster and sharpened nightly against the concrete floor while Gerald snored in the next room. I worked on it for months. The rhythm of metal on stone became my lullaby. I knew the exact angle to hold it, the precise pressure needed to keep the edge straight. I was preparing for a test I hoped I would never have to take, but in my bones I knew the day would come. Men like Gerald don't just watch forever. The watching is the overture. The violence is the main act. The day he finally cornered me, my mother was at work. Her double shift at the laundromat wouldn't end until midnight. Gerald had been drinking since noon. I could smell the cheap whiskey from across the room, that sour-sweet reek that clung to his clothes and his breath and the furniture. He came up behind me while I was washing dishes, and I felt his presence before I heard him, a change in the air pressure, a sudden heat at my back. His hand closed on my shoulder. His other hand grabbed the collar of my blouse. He ripped it open, and the buttons scattered across the linoleum like tiny white bones. The fabric tore, and there, pressed flat against my ribs, was the iron. I had imagined this moment 1,000 times. In my imagination, I was terrified. In reality, I was calm. My hand found the metal before my brain even registered the movement. Muscle memory from all those nights of practice. I turned, and I swung, and I didn't miss. I took his eyes. The blood was hot on my face, shockingly hot, like a splash of coffee fresh from the pot. It got in my mouth. It tasted like pennies and salt. He fell backward, screaming, his hands clawing at his face, and I stood over him holding the iron strip and smiling. I didn't know I was smiling until later, when I caught my reflection in the dark window and saw the blood and the teeth. I looked like something out of a horror movie. I looked like the monster he had been trying to create. The person who screamed next was my mother. She had come home early. Her shift got cut, she said later, some problem with the machines, and she found me standing in the kitchen, spattered in red, while her husband writhed on the floor. "What have you done?" she wailed. The words dissolved into sobs. "How will we live now? What will we do? Lillian, what have you done?" She didn't ask if I was hurt. She didn't ask what he had done to me. She asked how we would live. That was the moment I understood, with a clarity that cut deeper than any blade, that she had always known. She had known what Gerald was from the beginning. She had seen the way he looked at me, heard the way he spoke to me, noticed the locks I had started installing on my bedroom door. She had chosen not to see because seeing would have required action, and action would have cost her the roof over her head. "Don't worry, Mom," I said. My voice came out strange, flat, distant, like a radio signal from another country. "You won't have to live with him anymore." The police came. The ambulance came. Someone wrapped a blanket around my shoulders, and I remember thinking how absurd that was. A blanket, as if I were cold, as if this were a comfort and not a costume change for the next act. I was taken to a juvenile detention center. I spent 3 months there while the case wound through the system. My court-appointed lawyer was a young woman with tired eyes who believed me. That was the first miracle. The second was the judge, who looked at the medical evidence, my medical evidence, the cigarette burns on my arms that had scarred into pale circles, the old rib fractures that had healed crooked, the photos of the basement room with its single high window and its lock on the outside of the door, and ruled it self-defense. Justifiable self-defense. The words hit me like a physical blow. I had spent 3 months preparing to spend the rest of my adolescence in a cell, and instead they told me I was free. I walked out of the courthouse into a gray afternoon and stood on the steps, blinking at the sky. No one was waiting for me. My mother had not come to the trial. I was 15 years old, free, and completely alone. The next 10 years reshaped me. I ran. I didn't have a plan, just a direction, away. Away from the basement, away from my mother's silence, away from the girl who had smiled with blood on her face. I washed dishes in diners where the grease clung to your hair and the boss yelled at you in a dialect you didn't understand. I hauled lighting equipment on film sets, learning to be invisible in plain sight, the crew member no one noticed, the one who overheard everything. I slept in storage rooms and bus stations and once, for 2 weeks, in the back seat of an abandoned car. I talked my way into a job as an entertainment journalist, the lowest rung, the paparazzi-adjacent bottom feeder that nobody respects, which meant nobody watched me too closely. I was perfect for it. I had spent years learning how to observe without being observed, how to wait in the dark for hours without moving, how to see everything while showing nothing. That was where I met Ronnie. She was a photographer, wary and fearless, with a mouth like a sailor and a loyalty that would prove to be the only constant in my life. We were both scrapping for stories in the gutter of the entertainment industry, chasing C-list celebrities and political scandals, eating instant noodles in a van at 3 in the morning while we waited for a shot. One night we got cornered in an alley by 2 men with iron pipes. The subject of our investigation had sent Muscle to collect our memory cards. I had been in that alley before, in a different form. Ronnie stepped in front of me, a broken camera tripod in her hand, and shouted at me to run. I didn't run. I smashed a bottle against the wall and stood beside her. Afterward, in the emergency room, her shoulder dislocated, my forehead split open needing 7 stitches. She looked at me across the narrow gap between our gurneys and said, "You're insane. I like you. What's your deal?" I told her the truth. All of it. The basement, the iron, the blood, the smile. She listened without flinching. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, then said, "So you're a survivor. Good. Me too. Let's survive together." We did. For years, we did. Ronnie was the only person in the world who knew all of my secrets. She was the one who taught me how to build a new identity, how to bury my past under layers of misdirection, how to walk into a room and own it before anyone could question my right to be there. She was the one who held my hair back when I got food poisoning from bad street vendor dumplings and the one who talked me out of quitting a dozen times. And when Damian Cross entered my life, when the billionaire widower with the cold eyes and the careful smile offered me a way out of the gutter, she was the one who looked at me and said, "Be careful, Lillian. Men like that don't give anything away for free. Everything with them is a transaction. Make sure you know what you're selling." I didn't listen. Or rather, I listened, but I made my choice anyway. Damian was powerful, wealthy, and utterly self-contained. He didn't want love. He had loved once, his wife, and she had died in a car accident that left him with a closed-off heart and a reputation for never letting anyone get close. What he wanted was companionship without demands, presence without entanglement. I was perfect for that. I knew how to be present without being intrusive, how to anticipate needs without being asked, how to fill a silence without filling it with words. I had been training for that role my entire life. But then I got pregnant. And everything I thought I understood about myself shifted on its axis. I stood in my bathroom, holding a plastic stick with 2 pink lines, and felt something crack open inside my chest. I had never wanted to be a mother. My own mother had taught me that motherhood was a cage, a weakness, a slow suffocation dressed up as love. But looking at those 2 lines, I felt something else entirely. Possibility. A chance to be the mother I had never had. A chance to love someone without condition, without fear, without the constant calculation of survival. I called Ronnie. She came over immediately, took one look at my face, and said, "What do you want to do?" "I want to keep it." "Okay." No judgment. No hesitation. "What about Damian?" "He says he needs time. He can't publicly acknowledge a child. The board, the shareholders, the family reputation, there are complications." The words tasted like ash in my mouth. "He wants me to go away. Have the baby somewhere private. He'll provide for everything, but I can't be the mother publicly. Not yet. Maybe not ever." Ronnie's face went hard. "And you're okay with that?" "No." I met her eyes. "But I don't have a choice. I can't go back to where I was. I can't raise a child in a rented room with no security, no future. Damian can give her everything, schools, safety, a life I could never afford. If I have to be invisible to give her that, then I'll be invisible. I've been invisible before. I'm good at it." So I went to Vancouver. I gave birth to Mira in a private clinic, with a view of the mountains and nurses who called me Mrs. Vance, without irony. Damian paid for everything. He visited twice a year, always brief, always distant. He held Mira like she was a fragile package he was afraid of dropping. I watched him with her and felt something complicated, gratitude, resentment, a cold, creeping understanding that this man would never love our daughter the way she deserved to be loved. He was capable of many things, strategy, ambition, calculation. But not love. Love required vulnerability, and Damian Cross had bricked up that door the day his wife died. For 5 years, I lived a split life. In public, I was Lillian Vance, the enigmatic woman at Damian Cross's side, girlfriend, assistant, companion, the labels shifted depending on which tabloid you read. In private, I was Myra's mother, flying to Vancouver every few months, memorizing the curve of her cheek, the sound of her laugh, the way she said "mama" like it was the most natural word in the world. I kept no photos of her on my phone. I told no one except Ronnie. I lived like a spy in my own life, constantly erasing evidence of the one thing that mattered most to me. Every time I left Vancouver, Mira would cry, and I would hold it together until the plane took off, and then I would lock myself in the lavatory and sob until my throat was raw. Damian's plan, was that eventually, when the time was right, Mira would come to Hong Kong and be introduced as a distant relative's child we had taken in. An orphan niece. A charity case. Anything but what she actually was. I would be Auntie Lillian. I would watch my daughter grow up across a dinner table, calling another woman mother if Damian ever remarried. The thought ate at me like acid. But what could I do? I had no leverage. No power. No family name to wield. I was a girl from a basement with blood on her hands, and the only thing I had was patience. So I waited. I smiled. I crocheted blankets and made soup and played the role of the perfect, undemanding companion, while inside I was slowly, methodically building a case. Gathering information. Learning everything there was to know about Damian Cross, his business, his secrets, his weaknesses. Ronnie helped. We compiled files. Financial records, medical reports, corporate structures. I knew more about Damian's empire than anyone except his CFO. I knew about the offshore accounts, the shell companies, the deals that skirted the edge of legality. I knew about his health, the slow decline, the doctor visits he thought no one noticed, the lab results that showed his testosterone dropping and his sperm count dwindling. And I knew about Serena Blackwell. Serena had been in Damian's orbit for a decade. Old money, faded but still respectable. Her family had lost most of their fortune in a bad shipping deal, but the name still opened doors. She had attached herself to Damian early, hoping for a ring. When she got pregnant, she thought she had one. But Damian didn't marry her. He never would. He set her up in a luxury apartment, paid for everything, and kept her at arm's length. Their daughter was a secret just like Mira, acknowledged privately, denied publicly. The difference was that Serena had made peace with this arrangement. She had convinced herself that waiting was the same as winning, that eventually Damian would come around, that the ring would appear if she was patient enough. For 10 years, she had been patient. And then I arrived. A nobody. A former paparazzi with a murky past. And Damian had chosen me, not as a wife, but as something closer, something more intimate. I was the woman he came home to. I was the one who made his soup and knew his schedule and sat beside him at dinners. Serena hated me with a passion that bordered on religious. I was the living proof that Damian could commit to someone, just not to her. When Serena started digging into my past, I knew it was only a matter of time. When she found Vincent Aldrich, a disgraced financier with gambling debts and a connection to the old neighborhood where I grew up, I knew she was building a weapon. I let her. I watched her construct her trap, and I did nothing to stop it, because I had my own trap already laid. Hers was made of scandal and shame. Mine was made of 5 years of patience, a dossier of evidence, and the cold, clear knowledge that I had nothing left to lose. The night Serena sprung her trap, the air in the private dining room at the Peninsula was thick with money and pretension. The restaurant occupied a corner suite on the 28th floor, all velvet drapes and crystal chandeliers and waiters who moved like ghosts. Damian's quarterly appreciation dinner was a ritual, the same faces, the same toasts, the same careful dance of power disguised as friendship. Mr. Harrington from Harrington Properties was there, red-faced and jovial, the kind of man who had never missed a meal in his life. Beside him sat Margaret Chin, the shipping heiress whose family had been feuding with Serena's for 3 generations. The seating chart alone was a chessboard, and Damian had placed every piece himself. I was seated 3 chairs down from Damian, close enough to be visible, far enough to be dismissible. The arrangement was deliberate. I was not the hostess. I was not the guest of honor. I was the adjunct, the accessory, the woman whose presence was tolerated but not celebrated. I had been in this position 100 times, and I had learned to wear it like a comfortable coat. Invisible girl, ghost at the table. I smiled at the right moments, laughed at the right jokes, kept my wine glass at exactly the right level so the waiters would not feel compelled to refill it. I was a study in controlled neutrality. Serena, by contrast, was a firework. She had dressed in emerald silk that draped over her body like liquid, her shoulders bare, her collarbones dusted with highlighter, diamonds at her ears and throat that probably cost more than the GDP of a small island nation. She sat at Damian's right hand, a position she had claimed years ago and defended with the ferocity of a lioness guarding her territory. She touched his arm when she laughed. She leaned in when she spoke. She performed intimacy with the precision of an actress who had been rehearsing the same role for a decade. Every gesture said, "I belong here. This is my place." She is the interloper. I watched her with a detachment that surprised even me. There was a time, early on, when Serena's presence had bothered me. Not because I loved Damian, I had never been foolish enough to love him, but because she represented something I could never be. She had a name, a lineage, a right to be in rooms like this that came from birth rather than survival. She had never sharpened metal in a basement. She had never washed dishes until her hands cracked and bled. She had never smiled at a man who disgusted her because smiling was safer than speaking. Serena's armor was made of entitlement and social capital. Mine was made of scar tissue. The dinner progressed through its usual phases. Appetizers, toasts, the clink of silver on porcelain. I ate sparingly, as I always did at these events, not because I was dieting, but because eating required lowering one's guard, and I never lowered my guard in public. Between courses, I kept my hands busy with small, invisible tasks, refolding my napkin, adjusting my water glass, stirring my soup in slow, silent circles. I had learned this trick years ago, in the tea house where I worked as a dishwasher and occasional waitress. The owner, a sharp-eyed woman named Mrs. Chin who had escaped her own war decades before, taught me that the secret to invisibility was stillness within motion. "Move, but move slowly," she said. "Fast movements draw the eye. A slow hand is a forgotten hand." She was right. At that table, surrounded by people who would have destroyed me if they knew who I really was, I was so still I practically disappeared. Then Serena leaned forward, a shark sensing blood, and said, "Damian, do you remember that terrible case from years ago? The stepfather who was blinded by his foster daughter. I heard her nickname was Lily. Isn't that curious?" The table went silent. Not the silence of people who hadn't heard, the silence of people who had heard very clearly and were deciding how to react. Mr. Harrington's fork paused halfway to his mouth. Margaret Chen's eyes flicked toward me, then away. Damian swirled his wine. The gesture was lazy, almost bored. "Lily. That's short for Lillian, isn't it?" He did not look at me. He looked at Serena. And in that small, deliberate choice, I understood exactly where I stood. He was not going to defend me. He was not going to change the subject or shut down the line of questioning. He was going to sit back and watch, the way a spectator watches a gladiatorial match, waiting to see which combatant was worth his continued investment. That was Damian's fundamental philosophy. He didn't protect people. He evaluated them. If you could survive, you deserved to stay. If you couldn't, you deserved to be discarded. Fine. I had been surviving since I was 8 years old. I set down my spoon, blotted my lips with my napkin, and raised my eyes to Vincent Aldridge. Serena's hired gun. He had the look of a man who had once been handsome and was now merely expensive, good suit, bad skin, the kind of restless, hungry energy that came from years of living beyond one's means. I had done my homework on him, thanks to Ronnie's relentless digging. Gambling debts in London. A failed investment scheme in Dubai. A string of lawsuits that had quietly been settled out of court. He was a desperate man, and desperate men were predictable. "Mr. Aldridge," I said. My voice was calm, conversational, as if I were commenting on the weather. "Serena seems very interested in that old case. You've lived abroad for so many years, perhaps you never heard how it ended." Serena's fork paused. Just a fraction of a second, a tiny hiccup in her rhythm, but I caught it. She had expected me to freeze, to stammer, to flush with shame. She had not expected me to take control of the narrative. "The case was ruled self-defense," I continued, meeting Aldridge's eyes. "I covered the story myself, in my days as a reporter. I requested the court files. The verdict is public record, anyone here can look it up. The girl was 15. The medical examiner documented evidence of prolonged, systematic abuse. She was acquitted. The judge ruled that she had acted to protect her own life, and the law agreed." I let the words settle over the table like falling snow. "The girl," I added, softer now, "had a difficult life. She was not a monster. She was just trying to survive." The silence stretched. Mr. Harrington coughed into his napkin. Margaret Chin took a very long sip of her wine. Serena's carefully constructed ambush was crumbling, and I could see the frustration flickering behind her composed expression. She had come armed with scandal and insinuation. I had responded with facts and the quiet, unassailable dignity of a survivor. It was not the battle she had planned for. "Fascinating," Serena said, her smile hardening at the edges. "You seem to know a great deal about this case, Lillian. Almost as if you have a personal connection to it. Would you care to share?" She was pushing now. Desperation showing through the cracks in her composure. The question was a gamble. If I admitted a connection, she had her headline. If I denied it and was later proven to be lying, she had an even bigger headline. Either way, she thought she had me cornered. I looked at her. Then I looked at Damian, who was still watching, still calculating, his face a mask of detached interest. "Serena," I said, and I let a small, sad smile touch the corners of my lips, "I think you already know the answer to that question. You wouldn't have brought Mr. Aldridge here tonight if you didn't. But I'm happy to tell you anyway." I turned back to the table. My mother remarried when I was 8. My stepfather was not a kind man. I left that house at 15, after an incident I don't like to discuss. I was very lucky. A restaurant owner took me in, gave me work, helped me finish my education. I have been on my own ever since. Nothing in my past is a secret. I'm simply someone who prefers to focus on the present. I picked up my spoon and resumed eating my soup. The table exhaled. The tension broke. Mr. Harrington launched into an anecdote about his recent golf tournament, and the conversation swerved gratefully away from scandal and back towards safer waters. Serena's face was a study in controlled fury. She had thrown her best punch, and I had absorbed it like water absorbing a stone. I was still there, still calm, still smiling. She wasn't finished, though. I saw her glance at her phone beneath the tablecloth, saw the screen light up with a recording app. She was still gathering evidence. Still hoping to catch me in a moment of weakness. Let her record. Let her gather. I had my own recordings. I had 5 years of them. And when the time came, I would play them all at once. The aftermath of Serena's dinner ambush unfolded with the grim inevitability of a Greek tragedy. Within 48 hours, the headlines erupted. Damian Cross's companion exposed, the runaway with a violent past. Lillian Vance, from diner waitress to billionaire's mistress. Exclusive audio, chilling confession from Cross's inner circle. Serena's media contacts had outdone themselves. The coverage was coordinated, vicious, and surgically precise. She had planted stories in 5 major outlets, each one hitting a different angle: the crime, the cover-up, the mysterious gap in my employment history, the insinuation that I had seduced Damian for his money. I read every single article. I read the comments too, the ones calling me a gold digger, a psychopath, a dangerous woman who shouldn't be allowed near decent people. The internet had made me a villain by lunchtime. By dinner, someone had found an old yearbook photo of me at 15, hollow-eyed, underweight, wearing a donated sweater 2 sizes too big, and placed it next to a photo of me at a charity gala in a gown Damian had paid for. The caption read, "From juvenile detention to billionaire's row." How does a girl like that end up here? The implication was clear. The answer they wanted was just as clear. I was a schemer. A manipulator. A woman who had used her body and her cunning to climb out of the gutter and into a life she didn't deserve. I sat on my balcony and crocheted. The morning after the story broke, the air was thick with humidity, the sky a pale, washed-out gray. I had made myself a pot of jasmine tea and settled into my favorite chair, a wrought iron bistro chair that Ronnie had found at a flea market and refinished herself. My crochet hook moved through the yarn with a rhythm so steady it felt like a heartbeat. In and out, loop and pull, stitch by stitch. The pattern I was working on was intricate, a lace-inspired motif that required constant attention. That was why I loved crochet. It demanded focus. When my hands were busy counting stitches, my mind could not spiral into panic. The panic was still there. I could feel it crouched in the back of my skull like a wild animal, but as long as I kept the hook moving, it stayed contained. Contained panic was manageable. Contained panic was just another problem to solve. Ronnie called around noon. "Have you seen the editorial in the South China Morning Post?" "I've seen everything. They're calling you the most dangerous woman in Hong Kong." "That's a hell of a title. You should put it on your business cards." "Too wordy." She snorted. "Seriously, Lillian. How are you holding up?" I looked down at my crochet. The yarn was a soft, dove-gray wool, expensive and warm. I had bought it at a tiny shop in Causeway Bay that specialized in imported fibers. The owner knew me by name now. I went there every few weeks, browsing the shelves, running my fingers over the skeins, selecting colors that reminded me of things I was not allowed to say out loud. This gray was the color of dawn over Vancouver Harbor. The color of the sky on the morning I had held Mira for the first time. "I'm fine," I said. "The press conference is tomorrow." Serena arranged it herself. She thinks I'll crack under the pressure. "Will you?" "No." I pulled a new loop of yarn through the stitch and tightened it gently. "I've been waiting for a public platform." She just handed me one. The press conference was held in the atrium of Cross Tower, a soaring glass and marble space that had been designed to intimidate. The ceiling arched 50 feet overhead, and the walls were lined with abstract sculptures that probably cost more than every apartment I had ever lived in combined. By the time I arrived, the room was packed. Cameras everywhere. Reporters spilling into the aisles. A low, buzzing hum of anticipation, like the sound of a stadium before the gladiators enter. I had dressed carefully. Not expensively, carefully. A plain white blouse, no visible designer label. Black trousers, neatly pressed but not tailored. Low heels that I could walk in without wobbling. My hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and my makeup was minimal, a touch of concealer under my eyes, a swipe of tinted lip balm. I had deliberately not covered the shadows beneath my eyes. Those shadows were evidence. Let the cameras see them. Let the world see that this woman has not slept in 3 days. Ms. Vance. Over here. Ms. Vance, is it true you attacked your stepfather with a weapon? Are you and Mr. Cross engaged? Married? What is your official status? Ms. Vance, do you deny that you've been living off Mr. Cross's money for years? I walked to the podium without acknowledging any of them. The noise washed over me like static. I set my notes on the lectern. I wouldn't need them, but the prop was useful, and adjusted the microphone. Then I stood there, hands resting lightly on the wood, and waited. The shouting continued for nearly a full minute. I let them exhaust themselves. I watched the front row of reporters, tracking their body language, noting which ones were genuinely curious and which ones had been planted by Serena to ask the most damaging questions. The planted ones were easy to spot. They didn't take notes, they just shouted the same question over and over, and they kept glancing toward a woman in the back who I recognized as one of Serena's public relations consultants. When the noise finally ebbed, I leaned toward the microphone. Thank you all for coming. My voice was soft but clear, amplified perfectly by the sound system. I will read a brief statement, and then I will take no questions. This is not a negotiation. This is not a press opportunity. This is me, telling the truth once, for the record. The room went very quiet. First, I said, I want to confirm one fact. Yes, I ran away from my stepfather's home at the age of 15. This is true. I have never denied it. The details of what happened in that house are documented in a court case that is public record. The case number is available through the judicial archives. Anyone who wishes to verify the facts can do so. I was charged, tried, and acquitted on the grounds of justifiable self-defense. I was a minor. The records were sealed, but the verdict is accessible. That is the extent of my criminal history. I paused and let my gaze move across the crowd. Second, I want to address the audio recording that was leaked earlier this week. I know who made it. I know why it was edited. I know what was removed. What you heard was a fragment of a conversation that was deliberately cut to distort the truth. I will not dignify it with further analysis. What I will say is this: the person who recorded me without my consent and then distributed that recording to the press has committed a crime. I have not yet decided whether to pursue legal action. That will depend on what happens in the coming days. A murmur rippled through the room. I waited for it to subside. Third. I took a breath. This was the moment. Mr. Cross is not well. He has been under considerable stress, and his doctors have advised rest. This situation, these headlines, this scandal, has been manufactured entirely without his knowledge. He is not involved. He is not responsible. I want to state that as clearly as I possibly can. Damian Cross is an innocent party in this. Whatever mistakes I have made, whatever secrets I have kept, they are mine alone. I ask the press to respect his privacy and allow him to recover in peace. I paused. I will be taking no questions. Thank you. I stepped back from the podium. The room erupted. Reporters surged toward the stage, shouting over each other, cameras flashing like a thunderstorm. Security guards moved to block them. I turned and walked away, my heels clicking on the marble floor, and I did not look back. In the car, Ronnie was waiting. She had watched the whole thing on her phone, parked in a loading zone around the corner. "You magnificent liar," she said, starting the engine. "I didn't lie. I told the truth. I leaned my head against the window and closed my eyes. I just told it in the right order. You made yourself the villain and made him the victim. That's a hell of a strategy. It's the only strategy that works." I opened my eyes and watched the city slide past. Serena wanted me to look guilty. So I looked guilty. I looked so guilty that everyone will have to ask themselves, if she's this guilty, why is she protecting him? And the answer writes itself. Because she loves him. Because she's loyal. Because she's the only one in this whole mess who isn't trying to tear him down. And if she's protecting him, maybe she's protecting the truth too. Ronnie was quiet for a moment. "You're terrifying. You know that, right?" "I know." That night, Damian called. Not a video call this time, a voice call, which was unusual. His voice was tired, the edges frayed in a way I had never heard before. The press conference was well handled. I was sitting on my bed, the crochet blanket spread across my lap. I had finished it that afternoon. The last stitch had been tied off, the loose ends woven in. It was done. 1,000 hours of work, and it was done. "Thank you," I said. "I hope it helped. You took a lot of heat off me. I appreciate that." A pause. Serena was behind the leak. "I've confirmed it. She used Aldridge as a go-between. I'm dealing with it." I said nothing. I had known Serena was behind the leak from the moment it happened. What I hadn't known was whether Damian would act on that information. Apparently, being publicly embarrassed was a line even Serena could not cross with impunity. Or perhaps he was simply angry that she had made him look weak, that she had forced him to be reactive rather than in control. Damian's ego was a delicate instrument. Serena had damaged it. She would pay for that. "There's something else," Damian said. "I've made a decision about the wedding. It's going forward. Serena has been loyal to me for a long time. This mistake doesn't erase that." The words landed in my chest like a stone dropping into still water. The ripples spread outward, slow and cold. "I understand," I said. "I've made arrangements for Mira. When she arrives, Serena will be her legal guardian. It's cleaner that way. Less complicated for the press. You'll still be able to see her, of course. Holidays, birthdays. You'll be her aunt. It's a good solution for everyone. A good solution for everyone." The words repeated themselves in my head, an echo that wouldn't stop. A good solution for Damian, who could avoid a scandal about an illegitimate child. A good solution for Serena, who could play the magnanimous stepmother and shore up her social standing. A good solution for the shareholders and the board and the family reputation. But not a good solution for Mira. Not a good solution for me. "Of course," I said, because what else could I say? "That sounds sensible." "Good." He sounded relieved. "I knew you'd understand. You've always been practical, Lillian. That's what I value about you. You don't let emotions cloud your judgment." "Yes," I said. "I'm very practical." After the call ended, I sat in the dark for a long time. The blanket was finished. There was nothing left to crochet. My hands were empty, and in that emptiness, the panic I had been holding at bay for weeks finally broke through. I felt it in my chest first, a tightening, a pressure, like a fist closing around my heart. Then it spread. My hands started to shake. My breath came short and shallow. The walls of the room seemed to contract, and for a moment I was 15 again, standing in that basement kitchen with blood on my face and my mother screaming. I closed my eyes and forced myself to breathe. In for 4 counts. Hold for 4. Out for 4. It was a technique I had learned in therapy, years ago, after a panic attack had landed me in the emergency room. The therapist had been kind, had taught me grounding exercises, had told me that my body was reacting to old trauma with new fear and that the reaction was normal, was survivable, was not a sign of weakness. I had been skeptical at first. I had spent so many years suppressing everything that the idea of processing emotions felt like a foreign language. But I learned. I learned because I had to. Because if I didn't, the panic would eat me alive. When my breathing steadied, I opened my eyes. The room was still dark. The blanket was still finished. Damian was still going to marry Serena, and my daughter was still going to be taken from me. But I was still Lillian Vance. And I had not survived a basement and a courtroom and a decade of scrapping in the gutters of the entertainment industry just to lose my child to a woman who wore her privilege like a crown. I picked up my phone and called Ronnie. I need everything you have on Damian's health. His most recent labs, the fertility specialist's notes, the prescriptions. All of it. There was a pause. Then, okay. Give me 2 hours. And Ronnie, I need you to reach out to your contact at that Reproductive Medicine Institute in Munich. The one who sent us the preliminary research. I need to know if the protocol is ready. Another pause, longer this time. When Ronnie spoke again, her voice was careful. Lillian, are you sure about this? I looked at the finished blanket, folded neatly on the foot of my bed. It had taken me months to make. Months of patient, steady work, one stitch at a time. I had made something beautiful out of nothing. I had done it before. I could do it again. I'm sure, I said. It's time. The weeks leading up to the wedding were a masterclass in theater. Serena launched herself into the preparations with the fervor of a woman who had been waiting a decade for her moment and was determined to wring every drop of spectacle from it. The venue was the Grand Ballroom at the Peninsula, the same hotel where she had tried to humiliate me. The guest list was a who's who of Hong Kong society, plus a carefully curated selection of international media. The dress, according to a strategically leaked preview, was a custom Vera Wang with a 6-foot train and hand-sewn crystal beading that had taken 12 seamstresses 3 months to complete. Serena posted regular updates on her private social media, which Ronnie monitored with the dedication of an intelligence analyst. Each post was a small monument to Serena's victory: the cake tasting, the flower selection, the rehearsal dinner menu, the vintage Rolls-Royce that would transport her to the ceremony. She was building a narrative, and the narrative was, I have won. The interloper is vanquished. The kingdom is mine. I let her build it. I let her climb higher and higher, because the higher she climbed, the farther she would fall. Meanwhile, I cooked. I had been cooking for Damian for 3 years, ever since the first time he mentioned, almost offhandedly, that no one had made him a proper home-cooked meal since his wife died. I had seen the opening and taken it. Cooking was intimate without being romantic, domestic without being demanding. It was a service, and Damian understood services. He understood transactions. He did not understand love, but he understood soup. So I made soup. I made soup 3 times a week, carefully researched, meticulously prepared. I consulted traditional medicine practitioners and nutritionists. I sourced ingredients from specialty markets. I kept a detailed log of every meal I prepared, the ingredients, the quantities, the timing, his reactions, his energy levels, his mood. The log filled 2 notebooks, and then 3. Ronnie called it my grimoire, which was not entirely a joke. The night before the Chamber of Commerce annual gala, the event where Serena would make her final public appearance as a fiancée before the wedding, I made a special dinner. Free-range chicken, slow-simmered with goji berries and astragalus root. A side of stir-fried snow pea leaves with garlic. Steamed fish with ginger and scallions, the flesh tender enough to fall apart at the touch of a chopstick. And crab. Fresh Dungeness crab, steamed and cracked, the sweet meat glistening in the shell. Every dish was beautiful. Every dish was precisely what Damian liked. And every dish contained exactly what I needed it to contain, in quantities so small they were undetectable. A pinch here. A dash there. The cumulative effect of 3 years of careful, patient administration. I served the meal myself, as I always did. I poured his wine and refilled his water glass and sat across from him while he ate, answering his questions about the household accounts, the upcoming charity gala, the repairs that needed to be done on the east wing of the house. I was calm. I was pleasant. I was the perfect companion, the model of discretion and efficiency. After dinner, as he was finishing his coffee, Damian looked at me with something that almost resembled warmth. "You've been very understanding about all of this," he said. "The wedding, the arrangements for Mira. I know it hasn't been easy for you." "It's what's best for everyone," I said, echoing his words back to him. "That's what matters." He nodded, satisfied. He had always been satisfied with my answers. That was the trick, I had learned. Give him what he wanted to hear, and he would never look deeper. He was a man who saw only what he expected to see, and what he expected to see in me was compliance. He had never considered that compliance might be a weapon. That a woman who had survived what I had survived might be capable of patience on a scale he could not imagine. The night of the gala, the grand ballroom glittered like the inside of a jewelry box. Chandeliers dripped crystal from the ceiling. Centerpieces of white orchids and calla lilies towered over every table. The champagne was vintage Krug, and the guests were vintage money, old families, old fortunes, old grudges dressed up in silk and diamonds. I arrived alone, as I always did, and made my way to a spot on the mezzanine where I could observe without being observed. The gallery wrapped around the ballroom in a horseshoe shape, dimly lit and rarely used during events. Perfect for my purposes. Serena made her entrance at Damian's side, and the room sighed like a single organism. She was wearing emerald green, her signature color, the color of envy, the color she had worn the night she tried to destroy me. Her gown was velvet, fitted through the bodice and flaring at the hem, and around her throat was a necklace of emeralds and diamonds that had belonged to Damian's mother. She was wearing his family jewels. She was signaling, in the most public way possible, that she was already his wife in everything but the legal documents. The evening's program was designed as a coronation. Damian would receive the Business Leader of the Year award, a foregone conclusion, given his dominance of the Hong Kong business landscape, and Serena would present him with the ceremonial bouquet. The moment would be photographed from every angle, live-streamed to every financial news outlet, and immortalized as the official announcement of the Cross-Blackwell Union. Serena had choreographed every second of it. She had even rehearsed her smile in front of a mirror. Ronnie had learned from a source in the hotel, practicing the exact angle that would read as gracious rather than triumphant. I watched from above as the MC called Damian's name. The applause was thunderous. Damian rose from his seat, touched his tie, and walked to the stage with the measured confidence of a man who had never in his life doubted his right to occupy the center of any room. The spotlight found him and haloed him in gold. He shook the MC's hand, accepted the crystal trophy, and turned to face the audience. Then Serena glided up from the opposite wing, carrying a bouquet of white roses so large it looked like a small shrub. She was radiant. She was triumphant. She was, in that moment, exactly where she had always wanted to be. I took out my phone. I opened my messaging app. I typed a single word to Ronnie. Now. And then I waited. For a long, suspended moment, nothing happened. The MC was saying something about Damian's contributions to the city's economy. Serena was smiling, her arm linked through Damian's. The photographers were clicking away. The champagne was flowing. The world was turning exactly as it always had, exactly as Serena had planned. Then the doors at the back of the ballroom slammed open. Not the discreet service entrance. The main doors. The ones that led to the hotel lobby, where a gauntlet of press had been stationed all evening. 24 journalists surged through, cameras raised, voices overlapping in a cacophony of shouted questions. Behind them, more reporters pushed forward, and behind them, the general public who had been gathered outside craned to see what was happening. The security team, hired by Serena, loyal to Serena, tried to form a barrier, but the crowd was too large, too determined. The lead reporter, a woman I recognized from the financial news channel, was holding up a tablet with a photo displayed on the screen. It was a grainy shot of Damian in a Beijing hotel lobby, his arm around a young woman in a red dress. Not me. Not Serena. Someone else entirely. A B-list actress whose name had been linked to Damian's in gossip columns for months. The photo was damning. But it was nothing compared to what came next. Every phone in the ballroom buzzed simultaneously. The sound was surreal, hundreds of devices vibrating at once, a low, collective hum that seemed to come from the walls themselves. People reached for their pockets, their purses, their table settings. Screens lit up across the room like a constellation of tiny stars. And then, one by one, the notifications appeared. Breaking, Damian Cross's secret son, DNA report, birth certificate, surrogacy agreement leaked. Father, Damian Cross. Mother, Lillian Vance. Lillian Vance's hidden empire, properties, stock holdings, and a $170 million offshore trust fund revealed. Monthly child support payments of $42,000 spanning 5 years. Damian Cross's double life exposed, attempted transfer of illegitimate daughter to fiancée Serena Blackwell. Leaked audio confirms adoption agreement. The room went silent. Not the silence of shock, the silence of a held breath, of a world teetering on the edge of a cliff. Every head in the ballroom turned, slowly, like flowers tracking the sun. They turned toward the mezzanine. Toward me. I did not hide. I stepped forward to the railing, letting the dim light from the gallery catch my face. I was wearing a simple black dress, nothing flashy, nothing that would compete with Serena's emerald glory. I had planned my outfit as carefully as she had planned hers. She looked like a queen. I looked like a widow. The visual contrast was deliberate. I descended the spiral staircase slowly, one step at a time. My heels clicked on the marble. The crowd parted as I approached, creating a path between me and the stage. No one tried to stop me. No one spoke. They were all waiting, breath held, for whatever was going to happen next. Serena was still on the stage. Her bouquet had fallen. The white roses were scattered around her feet, petals separating, drifting across the polished floor. Her face was a mask of smeared makeup and raw, naked shock. She had not planned for this. None of her rehearsals had covered this scenario. "You," she whispered, and the microphone at the podium picked up her voice and amplified it through the room. "You did this. You monster. You destroyed everything." I reached the stage. I did not climb onto it. I stayed on the floor, looking up at her, which made the tableau even more striking. The fallen queen on high, the wronged woman below. "Serena," I said, and my voice was gentle, almost kind, "I didn't destroy anything. You did. You pushed. You schemed. You tried to take my child. Everything that's happening now is a consequence of your choices. I'm just the person who finally said no." I turned away from her and faced the cameras. Every news channel in the city was live at this point. The commotion had attracted every reporter in the hotel. I looked into the center camera, the one with the bright red tally light, and I spoke. "My name is Lillian Vance. I have a daughter with Damian Cross. Her name is Mira. She is 5 years old. She has been living in Canada for most of her life because Mr. Cross asked me to keep her hidden. I agreed because I was young and afraid and I thought I had no other choice. I was wrong. I have a choice now. And I choose my daughter." I paused. The room was so quiet I could hear the faint buzz of the chandeliers. "The documents that were released tonight are genuine. I authorized their release. Everything in them is true. If Mr. Cross wishes to dispute any of it, I welcome him to do so in a court of law, where discovery will allow both of us to present our full financial and personal records. I suspect he will not want that. I suspect he will want this to go away as quickly as possible. And that is fine with me. I don't want his money. I don't want his name. I want my child, and I want to live my life without being told that I have to hide who I am." I took a breath. My hands were steady. My voice was steady. Somewhere deep inside me, the 15-year-old girl who had stood in a basement with blood on her face was finally exhaling. "To Serena Blackwell, I bear you no ill will. You wanted something you couldn't have, and that's a pain I understand. But you crossed a line when you tried to take my daughter. Don't ever cross that line again. And to anyone else who thinks they can use my past against me, my past is public record. You can find it in the court archives. I was a victim who fought back. I have nothing to be ashamed of." I lifted the champagne glass I had been holding. I had carried it down from the mezzanine without even realizing, and held it up toward the cameras. "Cheers," I said softly. "Here's to the truth. It took a long time to get here, but it finally arrived." The fallout was biblical. Within hours, Cross Group's stock price went into freefall. The board convened an emergency meeting at 3 in the morning and voted to remove Damian as CEO pending an internal investigation. Serena's family, already hanging on to respectability by their fingernails, disowned her publicly, a statement released to the press calling her actions inconsistent with Blackwell family values. The irony was almost too rich to process. A family that had spent generations profiting from exploitation and colonial trade was suddenly concerned about values. Vincent Aldridge was arrested 3 days later at the airport, trying to board a flight to Bangkok with a one-way ticket and a suitcase full of cash. Ronnie had sent the Financial Crimes Unit a comprehensive dossier detailing his money laundering activities, his outstanding warrants in the UK, and his connection to an illegal gambling ring that operated out of a floating casino in international waters. He would not be bothering anyone for a very long time. The actress from Beijing gave birth to a healthy boy in a private clinic in Vancouver. She named him Daniel, but I would rename him Sebastian when the adoption papers were finalized. She signed the termination of parental rights without hesitation. She had never wanted to be a mother, she told me during our one and only meeting. She had just wanted a payday. She got it. I wired her the settlement we had agreed upon, enough to start over anywhere in the world, and she disappeared into a new life in a city where no one knew her name. And then there was the email from Munich. It arrived 6 months after the gala, on a rainy Tuesday morning. I was sitting in the kitchen of the Peak house, the house that was now legally mine, along with a significant portion of Damian's investment portfolio, negotiated as part of the settlement that kept him out of criminal court. Mira was at school. Sebastian was napping in the nursery upstairs, his tiny fingers curled around the edge of his blanket. The house was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of the housekeeper vacuuming the living room. My phone buzzed. An encrypted email, sender unknown. The subject line read, "Final report, RM001. I opened the attachment. It was a research document from a reproductive medicine institute in Munich. The title page was in German, but the summary had been translated into English. Long-term effects of compound administration on male primate reproductive function, final results. The test subject was identified only as RM001. The conclusion was marked with a yellow highlight. After 26 weeks of continuous administration, subject sperm motility declined to 8% of baseline. At 52 weeks, motility was undetectable. Discontinuation of the compound did not result in recovery. Finding: impairment is permanent and irreversible. I read the report twice. Then I closed the email, archived it in a password-protected folder, and deleted the original. I picked up my cup of tea, oolong, steeped for exactly 3 minutes, and took a sip. It was still warm. Upstairs, Sebastian began to cry. I set down my tea and went to get him. 3 years later, on an unseasonably warm Sunday in October, I took Mira and Sebastian to the beach at Repulse Bay. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, and the water glittered like scattered diamonds. Mira, now 8, splashed in the shallows with Ronnie, who had become the children's de facto aunt, godmother, and favorite person in the universe. Sebastian, a sturdy 3-year-old with his father's jawline and his mother's eyes, sat beside me on the blanket, diligently excavating a hole in the sand with a plastic shovel. "Mommy," Mira called, running up to me with wet feet and a seashell clutched in her fist. "Auntie Ronnie says we can get ice cream after. The kind with the sprinkles. Is that okay?" I looked at her. Her face was flushed with sun and happiness. Her hair, dark and thick like mine, was tangled with salt and wind. She was missing a front tooth, which made her smile slightly lopsided, and she had a scrape on her knee from climbing a tree the previous week. She was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. "Yes," I said. "Sprinkles are definitely okay." She cheered and sprinted back toward the water. Ronnie caught her around the waist and swung her in a circle, and Myra's laughter carried across the beach like music. Sebastian looked up from his hole. "I want sprinkles too," he announced. "You can have sprinkles," I assured him. "But first, let's finish this hole. I think it's almost deep enough to reach the other side of the world." He considered this gravely, then returned to his digging with renewed purpose. I leaned back on my hands and let the sun warm my face. For a moment, just a moment, I allowed myself to feel it, peace. Not the brittle, temporary peace of survival, but something deeper. Something that felt almost like contentment. I had a home. I had my children. I had a life that was mine, not borrowed, not hidden, not contingent on someone else's approval. It had cost me everything to get here. It had cost me years of my children's childhoods, pieces of my own humanity, and a moral line I had crossed without hesitation and could never uncross. But it had worked. Mira did not remember Vancouver anymore. She had stopped asking about the aunties and the other house about a year after we moved to the Peak. She was happy here. She had friends at school, a room painted her favorite shade of purple, a cat named Pancake who slept on her pillow. She called me Mommy without fear, without the whispered correction of Auntie Lillian that had haunted my nightmares for years. She was free. They both were. And Damian Cross was a ghost. He had left Hong Kong after the scandal, retreating to a villa in the south of France that he had purchased years ago through a shell company. He did not contact me. He did not contact the children. He sent a check once a year through his lawyers, a child support payment that I never cashed but never returned. The check sat in a drawer in my study, a stack of paper monuments to a man who had once ruled an empire and now ruled nothing. Sometimes I thought about what I had done to him, the slow, patient destruction of his legacy, the compound that had quietly, irreversibly ended his bloodline, and I waited for the guilt to come. It never did. Perhaps I had used up all my guilt years ago, in a basement kitchen with blood on my face and my mother's screams in my ears. Perhaps some people were simply beyond guilt. Or perhaps I was exactly the monster that Serena had always believed me to be. I had stopped caring about the distinction. Mommy. Mommy, come look. I found a crab. Mira was waving frantically from the water's edge. I pushed myself up from the blanket and walked down to the shoreline, Sebastian trailing behind me with his shovel still in hand. In a shallow tide pool, a tiny hermit crab was making its laborious way across the sand, its shell a spiral of pale pink and white. "Can we keep it?" Mira asked, her eyes wide. "No, baby. It belongs here. It needs the ocean." She pouted for a moment, then shrugged. "Okay. Bye, crab. Have a good life." I watched the crab disappear into a crevice between two rocks. It was small and fragile and utterly vulnerable, and yet it had survived, carrying its home on its back, retreating into its shell when threatened, emerging again when the danger passed. I understood that creature in a way that words could not capture. I had spent most of my life retreating and emerging, learning when to hide and when to fight. I was still learning. Ronnie appeared beside me, slightly out of breath, her hair escaping from its ponytail. "You look pensive," she said. "Pensive is dangerous. What are you thinking about?" I smiled. "Nothing. Everything. The crab. The crab." She nodded sagely. "Of course. The crab holds the secrets of the universe." It does, actually. The crab carries its home with it. It doesn't need anyone else to give it shelter. It just goes. And the world accommodates it. Ronnie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You know, for a woman who engineered one of the most ruthless corporate takedowns in modern history, you can be surprisingly sentimental. I learned from the best." "Who?" I looked at her. "You. The night in the alley. 2 men with pipes. You stepped in front of me. You told me to run." Ronnie's expression softened. "You didn't run, though. You smashed a bottle and stood next to me." "I know." I turned back to the ocean. The sun was beginning its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the water in shades of gold and amber. That was the first time I realized I didn't have to run anymore. That I could stand and fight. That someone would stand with me. Ronnie didn't say anything. She just put her arm around my shoulders and squeezed. We stood like that for a moment, 2 women who had crawled out of their own respective basements, watching the sun set over a city that had tried to destroy us both and failed. "Mama." Sebastian tugged at my hem. "Sprinkles. You promised." "I did promise." I scooped him up, settling him on my hip. He was getting heavy, 3 years old and solid as a small boulder. Come on, Mira. Ice cream time. Last one to the boardwalk is a rotten egg. Mira shrieked and took off running. Ronnie jogged after her, shouting something about unfair head starts. I followed more slowly, Sebastian's arms wrapped around my neck, his breath warm against my cheek. The boardwalk was crowded with families and couples and elderly people walking small, yappy dogs. The ice cream shop was painted in stripes of pink and white, with a plastic ice cream cone rotating slowly above the door. Mira pressed her nose against the glass display case, debating the relative merits of chocolate versus strawberry versus the rainbow sherbet that Ronnie insisted tasted like frozen toothpaste. In the end, everyone got what they wanted. Mira chose chocolate with rainbow sprinkles, Sebastian chose vanilla with gummy bears, Ronnie chose a double scoop of mint chip that she claimed was for the antioxidants, and I ordered a small cup of lemon sorbet. We sat on a bench facing the water, eating our ice cream in companionable silence. The sun had almost reached the horizon now, and the sky was a canvas of pink and orange and pale lavender. A few stars were beginning to emerge, faint pinpricks of light in the deepening blue. "Mama," Sebastian said, his face smeared with vanilla and melted gummy bears, "are we going home soon?" "Yes, sweetheart. Soon." "Good," he said. "I miss pancake." Mira rolled her eyes with the theatrical disdain of an 8-year-old who considered herself vastly more mature than her little brother. "You saw pancake this morning. You can't miss a cat after one day." "Can two." "Cannot. Can 2 times infinity. That's not a real number." "Is 2 a real number?" "Right, Mama. Infinity is a real number." I exchanged a glance with Ronnie, who was hiding a smile behind her ice cream cone. "It's a concept," I said diplomatically. "But you can definitely miss someone after one day. You can miss someone after 1 minute." Sebastian looked triumphantly at his sister. Mira huffed and returned to her chocolate cone with the air of someone who had been grievously wronged by the laws of mathematics. Later, after the ice cream was finished and the children were buckled into their car seats and the sun had fully disappeared below the horizon, I drove us home along the winding roads of the peak. The city glittered below us, a carpet of light stretching all the way to the harbor. Mira had fallen asleep in the back seat, her head resting against Sebastian's car seat. Sebastian was still awake, staring out the window at the lights with the quiet wonder of a child who still found the world magical. "Mommy," he said softly, "are we rich?" The question caught me off guard. "Why do you ask?" "At school, a boy said we were rich. He said our house is the biggest house." I considered my answer carefully. "We have enough," I said. "We have a home, and food, and warm clothes. We have each other. That's a kind of richness." Sebastian thought about this for a moment. "So we're not rich. Just regular rich." "I think," I said, "we're exactly the right amount of rich." He seemed satisfied with this. A few minutes later, his breathing evened out, and when I glanced in the rearview mirror, his eyes were closed. I drove the rest of the way home in silence, the radio playing something soft and instrumental. When we pulled into the driveway, the house was waiting, warm lights glowing in the windows, Pancake the cat silhouetted in the living room window, the garden rustling gently in the evening breeze. I carried Mira inside first, then Sebastian, tucking them both into their beds with kisses on their foreheads. Ronnie, who had been following me in her own car, let herself in through the kitchen and started making tea. When the children were settled, I joined her in the kitchen. She handed me a mug, oolong, the way I liked it, and we sat at the island counter, not talking, just being. It was the kind of silence that only comes from years of shared history, from having survived things together that neither of us would ever fully explain to anyone else. "Lillian," Ronnie said eventually, "are you happy?" I looked at her. It was a question she had never asked me before, in all the years we had known each other. Ronnie was not a person who asked about happiness. She was a person who asked about strategy, about logistics, about whether the evidence would hold up in court. Happiness was too abstract, too fragile a concept for women like us. But the question deserved an answer. "I don't know if happy is the right word," I said. "I don't know if I'm capable of happy in the way that other people mean it. But I'm at peace. For the first time in my life, I'm not afraid. I'm not waiting for the next disaster. I'm not calculating my next move. I'm just here. In this kitchen. Drinking tea with my best friend. While my children sleep upstairs in a house that belongs to us." I took a sip of tea. "If that's not happiness, it's close enough." Ronnie nodded slowly. "Good. That's good." She didn't say anything else, and neither did I. We finished our tea in silence, and then Ronnie rinsed her mug in the sink and announced that she was sleeping in the guest room because she was too tired to drive home. I told her the guest room was always made up. She said she knew. She had designed the guest room herself, back when we were renovating the house, had insisted on blackout curtains and a reading lamp with 3 brightness settings and a mattress that cost more than our first apartment's annual rent. "I know," I said. "That's why it's always made up. It's your room. It's been your room since we moved in." Ronnie paused in the doorway. For a moment, her expression flickered, something vulnerable, something young, something that belonged to the girl she had been before life had turned her hard. Then it was gone, replaced by her usual sardonic half-smile. "Don't get sentimental on me, Vance. Wouldn't dream of it." After Ronnie went upstairs, I sat in the living room for a while, the only light coming from a small table lamp and the ambient glow of the city through the windows. Pancake jumped onto my lap and curled into a tight, purring circle. I stroked her absently, thinking about the crab on the beach, the shell it carried on its back. Home, I thought, is not a place. It's not a house or a city or a country. It's the people who stand beside you when the men with pipes come. It's the children who call you Mama without fear. It's the friend who asks if you're happy, even when the question feels like a foreign language. I had spent so many years searching for a home. Running toward it, fighting for it, bleeding for it. And all along, it was here. It had been here since the night in the alley, when a girl with a broken camera tripod stepped in front of me and refused to run. I closed my eyes. Pancake purred. The city glittered. Somewhere upstairs, my children dreamed. And I, Lillian Vance, survivor, schemer, mother, monster, woman, finally rested. 6 months after that day at the beach, a letter arrived. It came in a cream-colored envelope with no return address, postmarked from a small town in the south of France. The handwriting was unfamiliar, shaky, uneven, the penmanship of someone who had once written with confidence and now struggled to hold a pen. I opened it at the kitchen table, my morning coffee growing cold beside me. The letter was short. 3 sentences, and signed. But I knew who it was from before I finished the first line. Asterisk, I know what you did. I've always known. I don't blame you. I would have done the same. Asterisk. I read it twice. Then I folded it carefully, walked to the kitchen sink, and held the corner of the paper to the flame of the gas stove. It caught immediately, curling into ash and smoke. I watched until there was nothing left but a smear of gray on the stainless steel. Mama, who was that from? Mira stood in the doorway, still in her pajamas, rubbing sleep from her eyes. She was 9 now, tall for her age, with a serious expression that sometimes made her look much older than she was. "No one important," I said, rinsing the ash down the drain. "Just junk mail. Are you hungry? I'm making pancakes. With chocolate chips. Is there any other kind?" She grinned, the gap-toothed grin of a child who had not yet learned that the world was a place where mothers burned letters from fathers and called it junk mail, and scrambled onto a stool at the counter. I made the pancakes. I poured the batter onto the griddle, watched the edges bubble and brown, flipped them with a practiced flick of the wrist. The kitchen filled with the smell of butter and chocolate and warm, sweet batter. Sebastian wandered down a few minutes later, his hair a wild nest of tangles, and demanded pancakes, with exactly 7 chocolate chips. "Mama, because I'm 7 now." Mira told him he was only 6.5. He informed her that half years count. An argument ensued. I mediated with the same careful diplomacy I had once used to negotiate boardroom disputes, and in the end, everyone got exactly 7 chocolate chips, regardless of age. It was such a small moment. Pancakes on a Tuesday morning. A squabble over chocolate chips. The ordinary chaos of an ordinary family. But as I stood at the stove, spatula in hand, listening to my children argue about fractions, I felt something I had never expected to feel: gratitude. Not for Damian, not for the money, not for the revenge. For this. The smallness of it. The quietness. The absolute, unremarkable safety of a Tuesday morning where the biggest crisis was an uneven distribution of chocolate chips. I had fought for this. I had bled for this. I had done things that would haunt me forever. And it was worth it. Every single moment of it was worth it. "Mommy," Sebastian said, his mouth full of pancake, "can we go to the beach again? I want to find another crab." "Me too," Mira added. "But this time I want to find a starfish. A purple one. Do they have purple starfish?" "I don't know," I said. "Let's find out together." I sat down at the table with my own plate of pancakes, 7 chocolate chips, just like everyone else, and joined my children for breakfast. Outside, the sun was rising over the peak, burning the last of the morning fog off the harbor. The city was waking up. Somewhere far away, a man in a villa in France was drinking his coffee alone, staring out at a sea that was not his own. And here, in a kitchen that smelled like pancakes and chocolate and home, Lillian Vance was exactly where she was supposed to be. She had finally stopped running. She had finally arrived.